No buzz. Just Bees Book Club. Year of Proust. It's going to be a little bit longer than a year, it turns out. The last one I finished was in February. Oops. These are the only ones that I'm actually not scheduling out, so this will be right, the Friday after I recorded this. Today, in this presumably extremely long video, do these in one take, no edits, so maybe I'll wrap it up in 15 minutes. Maybe I'll go so long that my phone battery dies and I'll have to splice some video together. Who knows? But we're talking today about Within a Budding Grove, In Search of Lost Time, Part 2 by Marcel Proust. This was initially published, I know this is the one that sort of brought him to fame. I want to say this is published in, like, 17 maybe? Let's see. No, 1919, okay. So Swan's Way was 1913, Within a Budding Grove was 1919. It won the Goncourt Prize, which is like the big literary prize in France. This sort of like establishes him as a major modernist author. I was reading Regards Marcel, a Substack newsletter from a person whose name I don't recall off the top of my head, unfortunately. It's very good, but in her most recent one, she mentions having been reading Virginia Woolf's Footnotes, and there was a really good line in there that I didn't commit to memory exactly, but she mentions that like Virginia Woolf had thoughts about Proust, obviously, and there's like some line that's something to the effect of like Proust is like as tough as catgut, but as dazzling or effervescent, I think, as like a blooming butterfly, which I thought was, hey, I should read more Virginia Woolf. Today we're tackling the entirety of book 2. Thing I've been, as I probably said in the Swan's Way episode, who knows, that was like 6 months ago. That wasn't 6 months ago, it was like 4 months ago. 5? Whatever. As I probably said there, I'm doing a book club. It was initially pitched as a Year of Proust, 100 pages a week, every week. That has obviously not happened with a person who is not a bee. It's because this is a Just Bees book club, but the world is the world. The world is the world. I don't know if you've heard this before. And so I have a bunch of notes here, and I'm gonna sort of just go through some stuff. Sort of high level. Let's see. What are the chapters here? All 2, 3 of them. Yeah, 2. So we start with Madame Swan at Home, Part 1. That is the first 300 pages, basically. Extremely high level. This is sort of some time in the life of Swan and Swan, I guess, but Monsieur Swan and Odette de Crécy, who married. They had a daughter named Gilberte, who is the narrator's sort of first love. So it sort of talks through like what it is like when the narrator sort of courting Gilberte, and then they become very close friends, and the narrator gets to spend time with Odette, with Madame Swan, in her house, and they sort of become close as well in a way that's sometimes very cute. This is Swan after, obviously, all of the events of Swan in Love, the portion of Swan's Way that I found a lot more difficult to get through this last time around. But yeah, that's so roughly high level. First 300 pages are the narrator falling for Gilberte. The image of the pink hawthorn comes up constantly, and it's great. And sort of beginning to exist in society. And then we get Part 2, Place Names the Place. As you may recall, Part 3 of Swan's Way was called Place Names the Name, and it's sort of it was a shorter, like maybe 100 pages, sort of meditation on places by way of their name. This is much longer. This is from, in this edition, this old Moncrieff Kilmartin Enright edition that has served me for the last 15 years, as you can kind of see by the cover. It actually looks much worse in person. That is $2.99, so page 300 through 720, which I believe is the final page before the notes, and down to no 730. So 430 pages rather than the like 100-ish of the similarly named thing in Swan's Way. That one is like to sort of give the plot, I guess. That one is all basically about the narrator's trip to Baalbek, this seaside town that came up in the first book, and he got so excited about going there that he had a asthma attack, I guess, for sort of doing a bit of biography as truth here, if we're assuming that the narrator is in some way based on Proust himself, which I think it's kind of impossible not to, although that doesn't mean all things are true. We'll get into it probably, or maybe not, who knows. There's so many things we could possibly get into. Anyway, previous book, the narrator obsesses over these train timetables to the point where he has basically a panic attack or an asthma attack, or he falls invalid. And in this book, he finally goes. He goes to Baalbek with his grandmother and stays there for basically a season and a half. There's constant references near the end of the book about the fact that like everyone has left, so it seems summer has ended, and it's probably like mid-fall by the time he's at the end of this book, because he doesn't actually leave. No, he never actually leaves, unless it's like on the last page. Yeah, he doesn't. So yeah, this is the trip to Baalbek. The narrator initially wants to go there because there's a sort of a famed church there, although he doesn't realize that the resort town and the church are like not super close. So he goes with his grandma. His grandma meets up with a friend, and he goes like a day early to go see the church, and is like, well, I mean, these frescoes are like cool, but like this is not what I was expecting at all. Which it is a theme we will get back to, because I think it's extremely important. The moments of sort of presumed aesthetic gratification that fail for various reasons in a particular moment, and we'll also get back to Elstier, the new painter that we're going to talk a lot about here. So he goes to the church and then goes to the resort town. He has a really hard time acclimating because he's a sensitive little flower, and then he sort of does begin acclimating, starts really falling in love with the town, and specifically with this group of girls that he sees. Sort of it's a beautiful moment that again we'll get back to, where he sort of sees these girls for the first time. They're sort of like this cloud of young women who are like self-driven and primarily self-interested in his eyes, and sort of obsesses over that. And there's stuff in the hotel, there's stuff with Bloch, a character who I still have no idea how to wrap my head around at all, and that's literally I think everything I'm going to say about Bloch at this point, other than I'll just say this also, there's some really rough anti-Semitism in this book. Also, an N-bomb gets kind of just dropped out of nowhere, so that sucks. But you know, by and large, it's a stay at a seaside resort for about 430 pages that just absolutely blew me away. I don't think I had this book in super high estimation the first time I read it. I think I did it kind of weird because when I first read these books, it was for a class in college, and I had already read Swan's Way at some point previous, and we were doing a thing where I think we were like reading all of them except for we were like sort of skipping, I want to say like The Captive and the Fugitive, maybe even also Sodom and Gomorrah, and I was like, no, I'm going to read them all. So I was like skimming through Swan's Way while also reading Within a Budding Grove so that I could sort of get a jump on everything. And have time to read, The Captain and the Fugitive at least, which I did do. I think I also said probably last time that I don't think I technically ever finished Time Regained, just because I was at a school with a quarter system. So last time I did this, like 15 years ago, we had 10 weeks to read Proust. So take it a little bit longer this time around. But yeah, I think because of the like dual reading and just trying to get through shit as fast as possible, because I was also taking like 3 other classes at this point. I don't think this overlapped with my Russian literature class where I was reading like Karenina and Dead Souls by Gogol and Brothers K. But it was that kind of shit that I was taking all the time, and I was reading a lot of books in a very short period of time. Which it turns out I still really quite like doing. Shall we get into it? Shall I say hello? Whatever. I almost did a thing and I didn't do a thing, so good for me. So yeah, Year of Proust is continuing despite it being halfway through the year and we're only finishing the second book. Yeah, so let's see. Year of Proust Within a Budding Grove. Fun little note. Swan and Odette are married. Cotard is a distinguished doctor because he's a stubborn dweeb, but in the right way. So yeah, right away we get to meet Cotard again, one of the members of the sort of the little group. I don't remember exactly what Madame Verderan's little pet name for her people are, but like Cotard was the doctor there who was like a complete fucking doofus, like ass. And when we get into this book, one of the sort of significations of the time that has been sort of skipped here is like Cotard is like really, really famous and really successful, and he's still kind of the same dweeb. And then one of the characters we get to meet is Monsieur de Nopois, a truly stultifyingly dull man who I think like the main thing he does from what I remember is like discourse very negatively about Bergotte, the novelist slash art critic, I guess, that the narrator has so fallen in love with in the first book. This is like one of the reasons that he falls for Gilberte is like, he sees her and is like, oh my god, she's so pretty or whatever. But more importantly, they talk and she has access to like a pamphlet of Bergotte. This is where the arts criticism thing on like Giotto or a medieval painter of some stripe or other, and he like gets obsessed with that, and etc. etc. But like Norpois' early introduction here is like the thing I wrote is he might be the best drawn character yet. Like he's this officious fucking he's in the army or in some sort of civil service like diplomacy thing, and he's just like a very well written example of like the kind of guy who like blows smoke up other people's asses for a living and who thinks himself extremely important because of it. At his suggestion, the narrator does get to go see the Racine's Fed. I think it's just Fed. And specifically like the performance by Burma, with a thing he also was obsessing over in the first book and also couldn't go because he got so excited about possibly going that he made himself ill. He does go to see it, and this is again one of the things we'll be touching on a number of times. He comes away going, oh, what was that? That didn't really live up to what I like imagined in my head. And like he literally talks about like wandering around the house, like reading the play and like speaking the play out loud and doing every potential like line read that he can think of because he's so excited to see this play, and then comes away with his expectations unmet. Yeah, there's a really weird scene on page 90 where the narrator and Gilberte wrestle, huge air quotes. basically it's a scene of him like trying to snatch a note away from her that she's coyly like hiding, and he pretty explicitly is just like, and then I came, like I busted, and then he like, she's like, oh, we can keep wrestling if you want to, and the line is something along the lines of like, I didn't want to let her know that my desires had been sated. So I fake wrestled with her for a little bit longer, just so it seemed like I was actually going for the note and not just the nut. Just weird. Didn't love that bit. First one I want to specifically pull to read from. It's a fun thing. This is a thing that was definitely like hit on pretty extensively with in the class, but there's a thing that happens that there's a potential interpretation of this. Proust is sort of, famously homosexual. Famously homosexual. What a faggy thing to say. He sorry, distracted myself there. The love interests throughout In Search of Lost Time are folks with names like Gilberte and Albertine. These are the two that we've been talking about very extensively today, at least, which is to say Gilbert and Albert. There's a very strong read of this where the love interests are sort of just like men who are presented as women, for reasons of social mores more than they are reasons of Proust's own inclination or the narrators, as distinct as we can draw a line between the two. So there's this moment on page 101, and this is just like a really nice, nice bit of writing, as so many things are. As regards this letter, at the foot of which Françoise refused to recognize Gilberte's name because the elaborate capital G leaning against an undotted I looked more like an A, while the final syllable was indefinitely prolonged by a waving flourish. Yeah, so Gilberte's signature just reads Albert with like a long line at the end, which is, obviously foreshadowing Albertine, who will become extremely important very shortly thereafter. I guess, a couple hundred pages, but we're reading a 3,000 page novel, right? So it's not that long, I guess. And it's just like a nice little aesthetic move to talk about how as he will extensively throughout the latter half of this, maybe the latter quarter, one of the things that the narrator thinks a lot about in terms of talking about love specifically is the sort of object of love, or the object of desire, is in some ways a stable object because it is a projection of one's own interests and desires. That is to say that the women that the narrator finds himself falling for are what you might say crudely of a type. He has a type. And it's just a nice moment of being like, the type persists through time. This is a novel called In Search of Lost Time. There's gonna be some time things. I don't know. That was I just quite enjoyed that little bit. We get some stuff with Princess Matilda, which is just weird. The like actual royalty in these books is fucking weird, and I don't have thoughts on it. But then the next thing I want to get to, yes, is on page 163. Because this kind of blew my fucking mind when I read it. Yes, okay, so this scene, God, there's a way of reading this book where the narrator is like the most clueless, naive tool in the world, which I kind of love. Given again what I'm saying over and over right now, which is like it is very hard to sort of dissolve the line, or to find any bright lines, right, between the narrator and the author in some aspects. Writing your younger self as a complete tool is like That's a fun move. I think it's good. I think it's nice to write oneself or a sort of avatar of oneself in such a way that is not sort of a hagiography, which I think it's entirely possible. And it not even possible. It does happen at times throughout this book, but there are also moments where he's just like totally, completely unobservant. Um, Such as this one where like not many pages before Gilbert has has sort of confessed to the narrator that one of the things she likes about him is that like he has a lot of sort of filial piety, that he is that she thinks at least that he is as attached to his father as she is to hers, and she mentions that she would like never do anything to upset Monsieur Swann. Um, that he's like the most important thing in the world to her. And then this sort of happens. Gilbert's features remained contracted in a frown throughout luncheon, after which she retired to her room. Then suddenly, without hesitating, and as though she had never at any point hesitated over her course of action, 2 o'clock! She exclaimed. You know the concert begins at 1:30. And she told her governess to make haste. But, I reminded her, won't your father be cross with you? Not the least little bit. Surely he was afraid it would look odd because of the anniversary. What do I care what people think? I think it's perfectly absurd to worry about other people in matters of sentiment. We feel things for ourselves, not for the public. Mademoiselle has very few pleasures, and she's been looking forward to going to this concert. I'm not going to deprive her of it just to satisfy public opinion. But, Gilbert, I protested, taking her by the arm, it's not to satisfy public opinion, it's to please your father. You're not going to start scolding me, I hope, she said sharply, plucking her arm away. So a lot of things happen here. This is specifically the anniversary of Monsieur Swann's father's passing, and it's like a day he takes very hard. And like I think that was literally what she was talking about when she said like she would never do anything to sort of upset her father, but she becomes fixated on this idea of going to this concert with the narrator, and sort of gets into a little row with her father about it, and that's where I started reading. The thing I want to lay down on like really hard here is the line taking her by the arm, and then her plucking her arm away. This is the first indication we get after the wrestling thing that already happened, that like these two aren't just friends who sit around at like a tea party and chat about the mores of the day or the fucking the latest paintings or whatever. But they have a relationship that involves physical touch. That this woman, this girl that the narrator has been just fawning over constantly and idealizing and turning into these particular images, is a person he can take by the arm. That was like a thing that just like immediately hit me. And then she plucked her arm away, and that was also just like, I mean, part of it is just like there are not a ton of moments of like pure physicality in this book. There's a lot of talking, there's a lot of thinking, right? The thing that really fucked me here, there's a line break there. Let's see. She plucked her arm away. Line break. A favor still more precious than their taking me with them to the zoo or a concert, but the Swans did not exclude me even from their friendship with Bergotte, and on and on. There is no way in Swann's way. Or I thought, at this point in this book, where Gilbert being upset with the narrator wouldn't cause him to spiral into 20 pages of thinking and unthinking and drafting and destroying letters and just absolutely spiraling into a fucking mess of himself. But we don't even get that. We don't get that. We get a line break instead. We don't get this concert. We get a line break instead. And like I said, when I was reading Anna Karenina for for school, one of the things that I remember very, very distinctly is there was a very important line break in that book, specifically when Anna and I believe it's Vronsky is the love interest. That it's been that's also been about 15 years since I even touched it. But I believe it's Vronsky and Anna when they consummate. So historically, line breaks can be used to to do things that you wouldn't necessarily be allowed to do. Let's say Tolstoy does not want to write smut at this point. I mean, he didn't in that explicit moment, at least. And so line breaks, I think, can be extremely important, and I think this one does the work of elision here in a way that is really, really fascinating, because I do think we are never going to leave the narrator who waits on Mama's kisses, right? That is going to be true of this person. The ways in which that is a sort of index of the anxiety that drives him in many aspects is going to stay true throughout all 7 of these books, as far as I remember. But this line break is an example of something else being prioritized here, because I do think you can read into it that what must have happened is he was devastated by this moment, that he was like, oh fuck, I've ruined everything, or maybe I guess the other thing you could read it as is a sort of moment of him falling out of love with Gilbert, or his idea of Gilbert, because that does sort of happen over the next 250 pages throughout here. He sort of begins to be more and more interested in Madame Swann and in Odette, but like that just was very, very powerful to me. Let's see. This is a little fun line. So like I mentioned, Bergotte is sort of the big artist figure, in the same way that Vinteuil was in the first book, sort of this big artist figure, the sonata coming up over and over, especially in Swan and Love. Bergotte kind of like picks up that that torch and becomes sort of like the narrator's window into the arts. And like I just read a few seconds ago, the Swan sort of introduced him. But I just really enjoyed this. Doubtless again to distinguish himself from the previous generation, too fond as it had been of abstractions, of weighty commonplaces, when Bergotte wished to speak favorably of a book, what he would quote with approval would always be some scene that furnished the reader with an image, some picture that had no rational meaning. Ah, yes, he would exclaim, it's good. There's a little girl in an orange shawl. It's excellent. Or again, oh yes, there's a passage in which there's a regiment marching along the street. Yes, it's good. Which is just like, I fucking love that. That's it. Me is like the way we would have said that a decade ago. But I was very happy with this narrator like idealizing this author who he thinks is like the best in the world, who he thinks like is accessing these super deep truths. And like Norpois's whole discourse earlier on is like, no, he's just a fucking like, he's just a guy who writes words in a pretty way, and then to actually have Bergotte oh yes it's good, there's a little girl in an orange shawl. It's excellent. It's like extremely fun to me. Extremely funny to me. I don't know. There's so much in this fucking book that I really just really appreciate. There's a good moment later where like the narrator's parents have been sort of like put off of Bergotte by way of Norpois, because they're like close with Monsieur d'Ampois. And the narrator is like, Mom and Dad, I went to go see Bergotte, and they're like, oh, you shouldn't really talk to that guy. He's not very good or whatever. And then the narrator just like breaks down and goes, but you said I was smart. And then the parents immediately go, you said you were smart? Oh, maybe rethink some of the thoughts we had. Like, it's just a very cute moment of like, yeah. There's another good line. I was not unhappy except one day at a time. It's on 226, 257. The time which we have at our disposal every day is elastic. The passions that we feel can expand it. Those that we inspire contract it, and habit fills up what remains. Just some good fucking lines. Do I want to read this bit? This is going fine. This is going fine. I'm doing fine. I'm still in Madame Swan at home, so this is gonna be a while. Oh yeah, we haven't really talked about Madame Swan all that much. So let's just start here. When it was still chilly afternoon in spring, she had taken me, before my break with her daughter, to the zoo, under her jacket, which she opened or buttoned up according as the exercise made her feel warm. The dog-toothed edging of her blouse suggested Take two. When, on a still chilly afternoon in spring, she had taken me, before my break with her daughter, to the zoo, under her jacket, which she opened or buttoned up according as the exercise made her feel warm, the dog-toothed edging of her blouse suggested a glimpse of the lapel of some non-existent waistcoat, such as she had been accustomed to wear some years earlier, when she had liked their edges to have the same slight indentations, and her scarf, of that same tartan to which she had remained faithful, but whose tones she had so far softened, red becoming pink and blue lilac, that one might almost have taken it for one of those pigeon's breast taffetas which were the latest novelty. It was knotted in such a way under her chin, without one's being able to make out where it was fastened. That one was irresistibly reminded of those bonnet strings which are now no longer worn. She need only hold out like this for a little longer, and young men attempting to understand her theory of dress would say, Madame Swan is quite a period in herself, isn't she? As in a fine literary style which superimposes different forms but is strengthened by a tradition that lies concealed behind them, so in Madame Swan's attire those half-tinted memories of waistcoats or of ringlets, sometimes a tendency at once repressed towards the all aboard, or even a distant and vague allusion to the follow me lad, kept alive beneath the concrete form the unfurnished likeness of other older forms which one would not have been able to find effectively reproduced by the milliner or the dressmaker, but about which one's thoughts incessantly hovered, and enveloped Madame Swan in a sort of nobility, perhaps because the very uselessness of these fripperies made them seem designed to serve some more than utilitarian purpose, perhaps because of the traces they preserved of vanished years, or else because of a vestimentary personality peculiar to this woman, which gave to the most dissimilar of her costumes a distinct family likeness. One felt that she did not dress simply for the comfort or the adornment of her body. She was surrounded by her garments as by the delicate and spiritualized machinery of a whole civilization. My note just says, archaeology of dress? Yeah, another example of Proust's aesthetic preoccupations are not mine. I'm not a flowers person. I'm not a dresses person. I'm not an architecture person. I'm not a medieval paintings person. The way he describes the aesthetic objects that he falls in love with, whether that's, a Gothic cathedral or a fucking a particular kind of lapel turned in just such a way as to suggest the follow me lads, whatever that means, it warms me in a really, really wonderful way. Let's see. Another just good little single line on page 333. So we're jumping into place names the place at this point. It is our noticing things that puts them in a room, our growing used to them that takes them away again. Our growing used to them that takes them away again and clears space for us. This is about habit, as so many things in this book are, which is fascinating because I feel like I'm not a huge reader of. I'm a pretty big reader. I can't think of a ton of novels of habit. Maybe that's just an older form thing. I think most of the stuff that I think about when I think about reading about habit is more about specifically addiction, which is interesting. This is a tome about habit, absolutely. And so this is the narrator talking about the ways in which, when he first arrives at the hotel in Baalbek, he's like completely overwhelmed. He's so used to his room. He's so in love with his room. He has turned his room into exactly what he wants it to be. And now he's in a new space. And he's just ruminating on the fact that like it seems so cluttered because he's seeing all these things, and it will become uncluttered as it does when he stops seeing them, not because they're not there, but because they are like, a, a part of the habitual, a part of the habitual. Um, uh, okay, 353. We get a little class warfare. Not a big, not as much of it as I usually prefer. But by engulfing them thus in a system of habits which they knew by heart, it sufficed to protect them from the mystery of the life that was going on all around them. All the long afternoon, the sea was suspended there before their eyes, only as a canvas of attractive coloring might hang on the wall of a wealthy bachelor's flat. And it was only in the intervals between hands that one of the players, finding nothing better to do, raised his eyes to it, to seek some indication of the weather or the time, and to remind the others that tea was ready. And at night they did not dine in the hotel, where, hidden springs of electricity flooding the great dining room with light, it became, as it were, an immense and wonderful aquarium against whose glass wall the working population of Balbec, the fishermen and also the tradesmen's families, clustered invisibly in the outer darkness, pressed their faces to watch the luxurious life of its occupants gently floating upon the golden eddies within. A thing as extraordinary to the poor as the life of strange fishes or mollusks. An important social question, this is in parenthetical now, whether the glass wall will always protect the banquets of those weird and wonderful creatures, or whether the obscure folk who watch them hungrily out of the night will not break in some day to gather them from their aquarium and devour them. Just a full-on eat the rich moment. There's another bit later on where, like, Francoise, who's the servant to the narrator's family, is constantly sort of talked about as being like sort of haughty and like feeling above other servants. There's really good moments actually earlier in the book where they talk about her food and it kind of kicks ass. She ends up making friends with a bunch of the other sort of servants and folks who work at the hotel. The line is like, so that what it amounted to was that we can no longer have any hot water because Francoise had become a friend of the person who heated it. I wrote in my little notebook, fuck yeah. Fuck yeah, Francois. That's solidarity. Okay. Oh, right. When I was mentioning the other stuff, I forgot there's like just a full-on gay bashing moment in the middle of this book, which is very weird. We got a couple good burns coming up here. Just another thing you don't super associate with Proust. Proust can be very funny. Not always. Not usually trying. There's a handful of lines that just go real hard. And yet his scrupulously ordered attire was far more sober and far more simple than that of any of the summer visitors I saw at Balbec, and reassured me as to my own suit, so often humiliated by the usual dazzling whiteness of their holiday garb. When my grandmother was coming towards me, we took our turn together, and I was waiting for her. An hour later, outside the hotel into which she had gone for a moment, when I saw emerge from it Madame de Villeparisis and Robert de Saint-Loup, and the stranger who had stared at me so intently outside the casino. Swift as a lightning flash, his look shot through me, just as at that moment when I first noticed him, and returned, as though he had not seen me, to hover, slightly lowered, before his eyes, deadened like the neutral look which feigns to see nothing without and is incapable of reporting anything to the mind within. The look which expresses merely the satisfaction of feeling round it the eyelids which it keeps apart with its beatific roundness, the devout and sanctimonious look that we see on the faces of certain hypocrites, the smug look on those of certain fools. I saw that he had changed his clothes. The suit he was wearing was darker even than the other, and no doubt true elegance lies nearer to simplicity than false. But there was something more. From close at hand, one felt that if color was almost entirely absent from these garments, it was not because he who had banished it from them was indifferent to it, but rather because for some reason he forbade himself the enjoyment of it. And the sobriety which they displayed seemed to be of the kind that comes from obedience to a rule of diet rather than from lack of appetite. Like, boom! This is the Baron de Gamma. Saint-Loup is going to be an extremely important figure throughout this whole book. I don't really need to get into it. They become very dear friends. The narrator has a lot of thoughts about friendship and whether he really likes it or not, to put it extremely vulgarly. Which sort of end up sort of disappearing once he becomes friends with the girls, who we'll be getting to shortly. What was the? Where's the? Do. Yeah, 474. Okay, this is really good. This is really good. This is really good. Um, is this a book? No, Marcel de Charlus. Uh, yeah. Okay. Um, oh right, the Baron is also Marcel de Charlus. This is the same person. It's a very weird thing happening with them. Um, uh, after all the lofty sentiments which I had heard him express that evening, next day, which was the day of his departure, on the beach in the morning, as I was on my way down to bathe, when Monsieur de Charlus came across to tell me that my grandmother was waiting for me to join her as soon as I left the water, I was greatly surprised to hear him say, pinching my neck, and as he spoke with a familiarity and a laugh that were frankly vulgar, "But he doesn't care a fig for his old grandmother, does he, eh, little rascal?" "What, monsieur, I adore her." "Monsieur," he said, stepping back a pace, with a glacial air, "you are still young. You should profit by your youth to learn two things. First, to refrain from expressing sentiments that are too natural not to be taken for granted. And secondly, not to rush into speech and reply to things that are said to you before you have penetrated their meaning. If you had taken this precaution a moment ago, you would have saved yourself the appearance of speaking at cross purposes like a deaf man, thereby adding a second absurdity to that of having anchors embroidered on your bathing dress." Boom! Charlie just absolutely bodying the narrator, making fun of his little baby swimsuit. Yeah. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're getting there, y'all. It's gonna be the longest one of these. Yeah, let's see. What else do I need to like touch on before I get to the final thing? There's so much good stuff on Austere here, sort of in the back. 200 pages. Honestly, the back 200 pages are some of the best writing I've ever read in my life. Like 500 to 730 ish. You get a lot of Austere here. Austere is the painter who's, if we have Vinteuil in the first book, we have Austere in this, and Bergotte in this one. They'll keep coming back, and I believe we get at least one more artist who becomes sort of like the narrator's things. What was the thing I wrote? Right. Maybe I'll just excerpt a quick thing from Austere because I think it's quite good. 573. It's not going to be a quick thing. This is like 2 pages. When I confessed to him at the disappointment I had felt on seeing the porch at Balbec, by the porch he means the church, and there's that church that I mentioned where he went before his grandmother, like to see, just because he was like so enamored of the idea of it, and then came away a little disappointed. "What?" he exclaimed. "You were disappointed by the porch? Why, it's the finest illustrated Bible that people have ever had. That Virgin and all the bas relief tell the story of her life. It's the most loving, the most inspired expression of that endless poem of adoration and praise in which the Middle Ages extolled the glory of the Madonna. If you only knew, side by side with the most scrupulous accuracy in rendering the sacred text, what exquisite trouvaille came to the old carver, what profound thoughts, what delicious poetry. The idea of that great sheet in which the angels carry the body of the Virgin, too sacred for them to venture to touch it with their hands." I'll skip a little parenthetical. "And the angel who carries away the Virgin's soul to reunite it with her body, or in the meeting of the Virgin with Elizabeth's gesture when she touches the Virgin's womb and marvels to feel that it is swollen, and the outstretched arm of the midwife who had refused without touching to believe in the Virgin's birth, and the loincloth thrown away by the Virgin to St. Thomas to give him proof of the resurrection, that veil too which the Virgin tears from her own breast to cover the nakedness of her Son, whose blood, the wine of the Eucharist, the Church collects from one side of him, while on the other the synagogue, its kingdom at an end, has its eyes bandaged, holds a half-broken scepter and lets fall, together with a crown that is slipping from its head, the tables of the old law. And the husband who, on the day of judgment, as he helps his young wife to rise from her grave, lays her hand against his own heart to reassure her, to prove to her that it is indeed beating. Isn't that also rather a stunning idea, really inspired? And the angel who is taking away the sun and the moon, which are no longer needed, since it is written that the light of the cross will be 7 times brighter than the light of the firmament, and the one who is dipping his hand into Jesus' bath to see whether the water is warm enough, and the one emerging from the clouds to place the crown on the Virgin's brow, and all the angels leaning from that vault of heaven between the balusters of the New Jerusalem, and throwing up their arms in horror or joy at the sight of the torments of the wicked or the bliss of the elect. Because it's all the circles of heaven, a whole gigantic poem full of theology and symbolism that you have there. It's prodigious. It's divine. It's 1,000 times anything better than anything you will see in Italy, where, for that matter, this very tympanum has been carefully copied by sculptors with far less genius. I don't give a shit about that, any of that, but I do love reading Elstier be just going so hard for his own aesthetic opinions in a way that I think, I read a bit from Bergotte. We didn't really get a lot from Vinteuil, because he just hasn't really come up other than like the particular phrase in the sonata that was so important to Swann and Odette when they were at the Vétéran. But Bergotte like has that sort of he's no Norpois, but he's a little stuffy. Elstier is just like pure passion for art, in a way that the narrator even can't let himself quite be yet, but you can feel him gearing up towards. But there's so much just like lovely conversation between the narrator and Elstier about art objects and how meaningful they can be and are. I think I was actually going for there was I wrote a little thing that just says, the great artists being those most willing to take a shine to our narrator is really a mood. By which I mean, like, it's like genuinely, like, if someone's really, really good and also, like, homies with you, that's, like, the best. I just really love that shit. I guess there's the other thing. There's a little yeah, this is as I've been going through this book, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, I think when I first read it and talked about it a lot, there's a lot of searching for truth claims throughout the book, because it's a book that presents itself like that, right? Like I just said, like, I don't really care about the truth claim anymore of whether that fictional church is truly a masterpiece. I'm more interested in the discursive aspects, the discussions that happen, the ways of framing things, and whatever. Been a deconstructionist or whatever. So a lot of times when the narrator proclaims some grand fact about the world, I go, okay, sure. I mean, that is a you are staking a position. You're performing an ideological function here, not you are telling me the truth. Here's one little sort of exception to that. It was along this train of thought, silently ruminated over by Elstier's side as I accompanied him to his door, that I was being led to the discovery that I had just made of the identity of his model, when this first discovery caused me to make a second, more disturbing still, concerning the identity of the artist. He had painted the portrait of Odette de Crécy. Could it possibly be that this man of genius, this sage, this recluse, this philosopher with his marvelous flow of conversation, who towered over everyone and everything, was the ridiculous, depraved painter who had at one time been adopted by the Vétéran? I asked him if he had known them, and whether by any chance it was he that they used to call Monsieur Biche. He answered me in the affirmative with no trace of embarrassment, as if my question referred to a period of his life that was already somewhat remote, and he had no suspicion of the extraordinary disillusionment he was causing me. But looking up, he read it on my face. His own assumed an expression of annoyance, and as we were now almost at the gate of his house, a man of less distinction of heart might simply have said goodbye to me a trifle dryly and taken care to avoid seeing me again. This, however, was not Elstier's way with me. Like the master that he was, and it was perhaps from the point of view of pure creativity, his one fault that he was a master in that sense of the word. For an artist, if he is to be absolutely true to the life of the spirit, must be alone and not squander his ego, even upon disciples. From every circumstance, whether involving himself in other people, he sought to extract, for the better edification of the young, the element of truth that it contained. He chose, therefore, instead of the words that might have avenged the injury to his pride, those that could prove instructive to me. There is no man, he began, however wise, who has not at some point, at some period of his youth, said things or lived a life, the memory of which is so unpleasant to him that he would gladly expunge it. And yet he ought not entirely regret it, because he cannot be certain that he has indeed become a wise man, so far as it is possible for any of us to be wise, unless he has passed through all the fatuous or unwholesome incarnations by which that ultimate stage must be preceded. I know that there are young people, the sons and grandsons of distinguished men, whose masters have instilled into them nobility of mind and moral refinement from their school days. They may perhaps have nothing to retract from their past lives. They could publish a signed account of everything they have ever said or done, but they are poor creatures, feeble descendants of doctrinaires, and their wisdom is negative and sterile. We do not receive wisdom. We must discover it for ourselves, after a journey through the wilderness which no one else can make for us, which no one can spare us, for our wisdom is the point of view from which we come at last to regard the world. The lives that you admire, the attitudes that seem noble to you, have not been shaped by a paterfamilias or a schoolmaster. They have sprung from very different beginnings, having been influenced by everything evil or commonplace that prevailed round about them. They represent a struggle and a victory. I can see that the picture of what we were at an earlier stage may not be recognizable and cannot, certainly, be pleasing to contemplate in later life. But we must not repudiate it, for it is a proof that we have really lived, and that it is in accordance with the laws of life and of the mind that we have, from the common elements of the life of studios, of artistic groups, assuming one is a painter, extracted something that transcends them. It's one of those moments where I was like, this is some real shit, though. This is like that real shit. Another quick good line. This is on 629, like many intellectuals, he was incapable of saying a simple thing in a simple way. He would find some precious qualifier for every statement and would sweep from the particular to the general. Get into something else. And then sort of to come back to this last thing, there's a moment on page 689 where the narrator, having become friends with the girls, is hanging out with Andrea, and she mentions like, oh, we're at this spot where that is still painted, and it's like the exact right time of day, so it's like, it's golden hour. Like, this is the moment where you've like aesthetically enjoyed so many times, and you get to see it in person. And the narrative sort of goes like, I think it's just because I got in a fight with Albertine that I just really don't, this view just isn't working for me. Like I said, I kind of wanted to have a bigger thought about that, right? I think it's easy to overlook this, and I think I did last time I read this book, and I'm only sort of coming to it now, but there are a number of moments of sort of disappointed aesthetic appreciation, right? We talked about the church, we talked about Resto's reaction to that. There's this thing at La Crunière. I have no idea how to pronounce that. There's other examples throughout, right? The Fed, Burma. I think these are extremely important moments if you're reading this book like I am this time, at least, as a thing whose primary theme is aesthetics. It's a book whose interest is in understanding, apprehending, conveying, and communicating the importance of aesthetics. That there be these moments, and that there be various of them, and for them to be done in different ways, where things that one would expect to be aesthetically pleasing fail to be, and again, in various ways here, right? Because the play is a failure to the narrator because he has hyped it up in his head so much, right? That'd be the way we would talk about it now. He too high of expectations. The landscape is a failure because of a specific personal moment that he's just gone through, where he's felt like a fool, and so he can't sort of access his own aesthetic desires in the same way that he usually can. I think these moments of breakage or failure that allow the narrator and allow Proust to talk about the kind of things that they want to talk about with aesthetics without falling into a sort of broad and frankly uninteresting idealism about them. There are these material moments of breakdown that happen uh, because of the observer, not because of the object. And I think that's become a very important thing to me throughout this book. Okay, I'm gonna start reading, and that's gonna be the rest of this video. So feel free to check the timestamp. However long between now and then is how long I'm just going to be straight up reading from this book. Let's go. Starting on page 530 in this edition. For some time past, the words of Bergotte, when he pronounced himself positive that, in spite of all I might say, I had been created to enjoy preeminently the pleasures of the mind, had restored to me, with regard to what I might succeed in achieving later on, a hope that was disappointed afresh every day by the boredom I felt on settling down before a writing table to start work on a critical essay or novel. Sorry. That was about halfway through. I started on 530. I'm actually starting on 503. My bad. I knew I was wrong. Yeah. Where is this? Okay, now on is actually just going to be me talking. Not me talking at all, as me reading. Left by myself, I was simply hanging about in front of the Grand Hotel until it was time for me to join my grandmother, when, still almost at the far end of the esplanade, along which they projected a striking patch of color, I saw 5 or 6 young girls as different in appearance and manner from all the people one was accustomed to see at Balbec, as would have been a flock of gulls arriving from God knows where and performing with measured tread upon the sands, the dawdlers flapping their wings to catch up with the rest, a parade the purpose of which seemed as obscure to the human bathers whom they do not appear to see as it is clearly determined in their own birdish minds. One of these unknown girls was pushing a bicycle in front of her. 2 others carried golf clubs, and their attire generally was in striking contrast to that of the other girls at Balbec, some of whom, it was true, went for sports, but without adopting a special outfit. It was the hour at which the ladies and gentlemen came out every day for a stroll along the front, exposed to the merciless fires of the lorgnette fastened upon them, as if they had each borne some disfigurement which she felt it her duty to inspect in the minutest details, by the senior judge's wife, proudly seated there with her back to the bandstand, in the middle of that dread line of chairs on which presently they too, actors turned critics, would come and establish themselves, to scrutinize in their turn the passing crowds. All these people who paced up and down the esplanade, lurching as heavily as if it had been the deck of a ship, for they could not lift a leg without at the same time waving their arms, turning their eyes, squaring their shoulders, compensating by a balancing movement on one side for the movement they had just made on the other, and puffing out their faces, pretending not to see so as to let it be thought that they were not interested in them, but covertly eyeing, for fear of running into them, the people who were walking beside or coming towards them, did in fact bump into them, became entangled with them, because each was mutually the object of the same secret attention veiled beneath the same apparent disdain. Love, and consequently fear, of the crowd being one of the most powerful motives in all human beings, whether they seek to please other people or to impress them, or to show that they despise them, and in the case of the solitary, even if his seclusion is absolute and lifelong, is often based on a deranged love of the crowd, which so far overrides every other feeling that, unable to win the admiration of his hall porter, of the passers-by, of the cabman he hails, he prefers not to be seen by them at all, and with that object abandons every activity that would oblige him to go out of doors. In the midst of all these people, some of whom were pursuing a train of thought, but then betrayed its instability by fitfulness of gesture, an aberrancy of gaze as inharmonious as the circumspect titubation of their neighbors, the girls whom I had noticed, with the control of gesture that comes from the perfect suppleness of one's own body, and a sincere contempt for the rest of humanity, were advancing straight ahead, without hesitation or stiffness, performing exactly the movements that they wished to perform, each of their limbs completely independent of the others, the rest of the body preserving that immobility which is so noticeable in good waltzers. They were now quite near me, although each was of a type absolutely different from the others. They all had beauty, but to tell the truth, I had seen them for so short a time, and without venturing to look hard at them, that I had not yet individualized any of them, except for one, whose straight nose and dark complexion singled her out from the rest, like the Arabian king in a Renaissance picture of the Epiphany. They were known to me only by a pair of hard, obstinate, and mocking eyes, for instance, or by cheeks whose pinkness had a coppery tint reminiscent of geraniums. And even these features I had not yet indissolubly attached to any one of these girls rather than to another. And when, according to the order in which the group met the eye, marvelous because the most different aspects were juxtaposed, because all the color scales were combined in it, but confused as a piece of music in which I was unable to isolate and identify at the moment of their passage the successive phrases, no sooner extinguished than forgotten. I saw a pallid oval, black eyes, green eyes emerge. I did not know if these were the same that had already charmed me a moment ago. I could not relate them to any one girl whom I had set apart from the rest and identified. And this want in my vision of the demarcations which I should presently establish between them permeated the group with a sort of shimmering harmony, the continuous transmutation of a fluid and mobile, collective and mobile beauty. It was not perhaps mere chance in life that, in forming this group of friends, had chosen them all so beautiful. Perhaps these girls, whose demeanor was enough to reveal their bold, hard, and frivolous natures, extremely aware of everything that was ludicrous or ugly, and capable of yielding to an intellectual or moral attraction, had naturally felt a certain repulsion for all those among the companions of their own age in whom a pensive or sensitive disposition was betrayed by shyness, awkwardness, constraint, by what they would regard as antipathetic, and from such had held aloof, while attaching themselves conversely to others to whom they were drawn by a certain blend of grace, suppleness, and physical elegance, the only form in which they were able to picture a straightforward and attractive character, and the promise of pleasant hours in one another's company. Perhaps, too, the class to which they belonged, a class which I should not have found it easy to define, was at that point in its evolution when, thanks either to its growing wealth and leisure, or to new sporting habits now prevalent even among certain elements of the working class, and a physical culture to which had not yet been added the culture of the mind, a social group comparable to the smooth and prolific schools of sculpture, which have not yet gone in for tortured expression, produces naturally and in abundance fine bodies, fine legs, fine hips, wholesome, serene faces with an air of agility and guile. And were they not noble and calm models of human beauty that I beheld out there, outlined against the sea like statues exposed to the sunlight on a Grecian shore? Just as if within their little band, which progressed along the esplanade like a luminous comet, they had decided that the surrounding crowd was composed of beings of another race, not even whose sufferings could awaken in them any sense of fellowship. They appeared not to see them, forced those who had stopped to talk to step aside. Forced those who had stopped to talk to step aside, as though from the path of a machine which had been set going by itself and which could not be expected to avoid pedestrians. And if some terrified or furious old gentleman, whose existence they did not even acknowledge, and whose contact they spurned, took precipitate and ludicrous flight, they merely looked at one another and laughed. They had, for whatever did not form part of their group, no affectation of contempt. Their genuine contempt was sufficient. But they could not set eyes on an obstacle without amusing themselves by clearing it, either in a running jump or with both feet together, because they were all brimming over with the exuberance that youth so urgently needs to expend that even when it is unhappy or unwell, obedient rather to the necessities of age than to the mood of the day, it can never let it pass an opportunity to jump or to slide without indulging in it conscientiously, interrupting and even interspersing even the slowest walk. As Chopin, his most melancholy phrase, with graceful deviations in which caprice is blended with virtuosity. The wife of an elderly banker, after hesitating between various possible exposures for her husband, had settled on him in a deck chair facing the esplanade, sheltered from wind and sun by the bandstand. Having seen him comfortably installed there, she had gone to buy a newspaper, which she would read aloud to him by way of a diversion, one of her little absences which she never prolonged for more than 5 minutes, which seemed to her quite long enough, but which she repeated at fairly frequent intervals, so that this old husband, on whom she was lavished an attention that she took care to conceal, should have the impression that he was still quite alive and like other people and was in no need of protection. The platform of the bandstand provided, above his head, a natural and tempting springboard, across which, without a moment's hesitation, the eldest of the little band began to run. She jumped over the terrified old man, whose yachting cap was brushed by her nimble feet, to the great delight of the other girls, especially of a pair of green eyes and a doll-like face, which expressed for that bold act an admiration and a merriment in which I seemed to discern a trace of shyness, a shamefaced and blustering shyness which did not exist in the others, "Oh, the poor old boy. I feel sorry for him. He looks half dead," said a girl in a rasping voice, with more sarcasm than sympathy. They walked on a little way, then stopped for a moment in the middle of the road, oblivious of the fact that they were impeding the passage of other people, in an agglomerate that was at once irregular in shape, compact, weird, and shrill, like an assembly of birds before taking flight. Then they resumed their leisurely stroll along the esplanade, against the background of the sea. By this time their charming features had ceased to be indistinct and jumbled. I had dealt them like cards into so many heaps to compose, failing the names of which I was still ignorant. The tall one who had jumped over the old banker, the little one silhouetted against the horizon of sea, with her plump and rosy cheeks and green eyes, the one with a straight nose and dark complexion who stood out among the rest, another with a face as white as an egg in which a tiny nose described an arc of a circle like a chicken's beak, a face such as one sometimes sees in the very young, yet another also tall, wearing a hooded cape, which gave her so shabby an appearance and so contradicted the elegance of the figure beneath, that the explanation which suggested itself was that this girl must have parents of high position who valued their self-esteem so far above the visitors to Belbeck and the sartorial elegance of their own children that it was a matter of the utmost indifference to them that their daughter should stroll on the front dressed in a way which humbler people would have considered too modest. A girl with brilliant laughing eyes and plump matte cheeks, a black polo cap crammed on her head, who was pushing a bicycle with such an uninhibited swing of the hips and using slang terms so typical of the gutter and shouting so loudly when I passed her, although among her expressions I caught that tiresome phrase, living one's own life, that abandoning the hypothesis which her friend's hooded cape had prompted me to formulate, I concluded instead that all these girls belonged to the population which frequents the velodromes, and must be the very juvenile mistresses of racing cyclists. In any event, none of my suppositions embraced the possibility of their being virtuous. At first sight, in the way in which they looked at one another and laughed, and the insistent stare of the one with the matte complexion, I had grasped that they were not. Besides, my grandmother had always watched over me with a delicacy too tremulous for me not to believe that the sum total of the things one ought not to do is indivisible, and that girls who are lacking in respect for their elders would not suddenly be stopped short by scruples at the prospect of pleasures more tempting than that of jumping over an octogenarian. Though they were now separately identifiable, still the interplay of their eyes, animated with self-assurance and the spirit of comradeship, and lit up from one moment to the next, either by the interest or the insolent indifference which shone from each of them according to whether her glance was directed at her friends or at passers-by, together with the consciousness of knowing one another intimately enough always to go together in an exclusive gang, established between their independent and separate bodies as they slowly advanced, an invisible but harmonious bond, like a single warm shadow, a single atmosphere, making of them a whole as homogeneous in its parts as it was different from the crowd through which their procession gradually wound. For an instant, as I passed the dark one with the plump cheeks who was wheeling a bicycle, I caught her smiling, sidelong glance, as I aimed from the center of that inhuman world which enclosed the life of this little tribe, an inaccessible, unknown world wherein the idea of what I was could certainly never penetrate or find a place. Wholly occupied with what her companions were saying, had she seen me, this young girl in the polo cap pulled down very low over her forehead. At the moment in which the dark ray emanating from her eyes had fallen on me, if she had seen me, what could I have represented to her? From the depths of what universe did she discern me? It would have been as difficult for me to say as when certain distinguishing features in a neighboring planet are made visible thanks to the telescope. It is to conclude therefrom that human beings inhabit it, and that they can see us, and to guess what ideas the sight of us can have aroused in their minds. If we thought that the eyes of such a girl were merely two glittering sequins of mica, we should not be athirst to know her and to unite her life to ours. But we sense that what shines in those reflecting discs is not due solely to their material composition, but is the dark shadows unknown to us of the ideas that person cherishes about the people and places she knows, the turf of racecourses, the sand of cycling tracks, over which, pedaling on past fields and woods, she would have drawn me after her, that little Paris, more seductive to me than she of the Persian paradise. The shadows, too, of the home to which she will presently return, of the plans that she is forming or that others have formed for her, and above all, that it is she, with her desires, her sympathies, her revulsions, her obscure and incessant will. I knew that I should never possess this young cyclist if I did not possess also what was in her eyes. And it was consequently her whole life that filled me with desire, a sorrowful desire because I felt that it was not to be fulfilled, but an exhilarating one because what had hitherto been my life having ceased of a sudden to be my whole life, being now no more now than a small part of the space stretching out before me, which I was burning to cover and which was composed of the lives of these girls, it offered me that prolongation, that possible multiplication of oneself, which is happiness. And no doubt the fact that we had, these girls and I, not one habit, as we had not one idea, in common, must make it more difficult for me to make friends with them and to win their regard. But perhaps also it was thanks to those differences, to my consciousness, that not a single element that I knew or possessed entered into the composition of the nature and actions of these girls. The satiated? That satiety had been succeeded in me by a thirst, akin to that with which a parched land burns, for a life which my soul, because it had never until now received one drop of it, would absorb all the more greedily, in long draughts, and with a more perfect imbibation. I had looked so closely at the dark cyclist with the bright eyes that she seemed to notice my attention, and said to the tallest of the girls something that I could not hear, but that made her laugh. Truth to tell, this dark-haired one was not the one who attracted me most, simply because she was dark and because, since the day on which, from the little path by Tansonville, I had seen Gilbert, a girl with reddish hair and golden skin had remained for me the inaccessible ideal. But had I not loved Gilbert herself principally because she had appeared to me haloed with that aureola of being the friend of Bergotte, or of going to look at cathedrals with him? And in the same way, could I not rejoice at having seen this dark girl look at me, which made me hope that it would be easier for me to get to know her first? For she would introduce me to the pitiless one who had jumped over the old man's head, to the cruel one who had said, "I feel sorry for the poor old boy," to all these girls in turn, of whom she enjoyed the prestige of being the inseparable companion. And yet the supposition that I might some day be the friend of one or the other of these girls, that these eyes, whose incomprehensible gaze struck me from time to time, and played unwittingly upon me like an effect of sunlight on a wall, might ever, by some mysterious alchemy, allow the idea of my existence, some affection for my person, to interpenetrate their ineffable particles, that I myself might some day take my place among them in the evolution of their course by the sea's edge. That supposition appeared to me to contain with it a contradiction as insoluble as if, standing before some Attic frieze or a fresco representing a procession, I believed it possible for me, the spectator, to take my place, beloved of them, among the divine participants. Was, then, the happiness of knowing these girls unattainable? Certainly it would not have been the first of its kind that I had renounced. I had only to recall the numberless strangers whom, even at Balbec, the carriage bowling away from them at full speed had forced me forever to abandon. And indeed the pleasures I derived from the little band, as noble as if it had been composed of Hellenic virgins, arose from the fact that it had something of the fleetingness of the passing figures on the road, this evanescence of persons who are not known to us, who force us to cast off from our habitual life, in which the women of whose society we frequent have all, in course of time, laid bare their blemishes, urges us into that state of pursuit in which there is no longer anything to stem the tide of imagination. To strip our pleasures of imagination is to reduce them to their own dimensions, that is to say, to nothing. Offered me by one of those procuresses, whose good offices, as has been seen, I by no means always scorned, withdrawn from the element which gave them so many nuances, such impreciseness, these girls would have enchanted me less. We need imagination, awakened by the uncertainty of being unable to attain its object, to create a goal which hides the other goal from us. And by substituting for sensual pleasures the idea of penetrating another life, prevents us from recognizing that pleasure, from tasting its true savor, from restricting it to its own range. We need between us and the fish which, if we saw it for the first time cooked and served on a table, would not appear worth the endless shifts and wiles required to catch it. The intervention, during our afternoons with a rod, of the rippling eddy to whose surface come flashing, without our quite knowing what we intend to do with them, the bright gleam of flesh, the hint of a form, and the fluidity of a transparent and mobile azure. These girls benefited also by that alteration of social proportions characteristic of seaside life. All the advantages which, in our ordinary environment, extend and enhance us, we there find to have become invisible, in fact eliminated, while on the other hand, the people whom we suppose, without reason, to enjoy similar advantages appear to us amplified to artificial dimensions. This made it easier for unknown women in general, and today for these girls in particular, to acquire an enormous importance in my eyes, and impossible to make them aware of such importance as I might myself possess. But the parade of the little band could be said to be an excerpt from the endless flight of passing women, which had always disturbed me. That flight was here reduced to a movement so slow as to approach immobility. And the very fact that, in a phase so far from the rapid phases A phase so far from the rapid. In a phase so far from rapid, faces no longer swept away in a whirlwind, but calm and distinct, still seemed to me beautiful, prevented me from thinking, as I had so often thought when Madame de Villepercy's carriage bore me away, that at closer quarters, if I had stopped for a moment, certain details, a pockmarked skin, a flaw in the nostrils, a gawping expression, a grimace of a smile, an ugly figure, might have been substituted in the face and body of the woman for those that I had doubtless imagined. For no more than a pretty outline, the glimpse of a fresh complexion, had suffered for me to add, in entire good faith, a ravishing shoulder, a delicious glance of which I carried in my mind forever a memory of or a preconceived idea, those rapid decipherings of a person whom we momentarily glimpse exposing us thus to the same errors as those too rapid reading, in which, on the basis of a single syllable and without waiting to identify the rest, we replace the word that is in the text by a wholly different word with which our memory supplies us. It could not be so with me now. I had looked at their faces long and carefully. I had seen each of them not from every angle, and rarely in full face, but all the same in 2 or 3 aspects different enough to enable me to make the necessary correction or verification, to prove the difficult supposition of line and color that are hazarded at first sight, and to see subsist in them, through successive expressions, something unalterably material. I could say to myself with conviction that neither in Paris nor at Balbec, one of the most favorable assumptions of what, even if I had been able to stop and talk to them, passing women who had caught my eye would have been like, had there ever been any whose appearance, followed by their disappearance without my having got to know them, had left me with more regret than I would with these, had given me the idea that their friendship could be so intoxicating. Never among actresses or peasants or convent girls had I seen anything so beautiful, impregnated with so much that was unknown, so inestimably precious, so apparently inaccessible. They were of the unknown and potential happiness of life, an illustration so delicious and in so perfect a state that it was almost for intellectual reasons that I was sick with despair at the thought of being unable to sample, in unique conditions which left no room for any possibility of error, all that is most mysterious in the beauty of which we desire, and which we console ourselves for never possessing by demanding pleasure, as Swann had always refused to do before Odette's day, from women whom we have not desired, so that we die without ever having known that other pleasure. Never known what that other pleasure was. It might well be, of course, that it was not in reality an unknown pleasure, that on close inspection its mystery would dissolve, that it was no more than a projection, a mirage of desire. But in that case I had only to blame the compulsion of a law of nature, which if it applied to these girls would apply to all, and not the imperfection of the object. For it was the one that I would not have for it was the one that I would have chosen above all others, convinced as I was with a botanist's satisfaction that it was not possible to find gathered together rarer specimens than these young flowers that at this moment before my eyes were breaking the line of the sea with their slender hedge, like a bower of Pennsylvania roses adorning a cliffside garden, between whose blooms is contained the whole tract of ocean crossed by some steamer, so slow in gliding along the blue horizontal line that stretches from one stem to the next, that an idle butterfly, dawdling in the cup of a flower which the ship's hull has long since passed, can wait, before flying off in time to arrive before it, until nothing but the tiniest chink of blue that still separates the prow from the first petal of the flower, toward which it is steering. I went indoors because I was to dine at Rivebelle with Robert, and my grandmother insisted that on those evenings, before going out, I must lie down for an hour on my bed, a rest which the Balbec doctor presently ordered me to extend to all other evenings too. As it happened, there was no need, when one went indoors, to leave the Esplanade and to enter the hotel by the hall, that is to say, from the back. By virtue of an alteration of the clock which reminded me of those Saturdays when, at Combray, we used to have lunch an hour earlier, now with summer at the full, the days had become so long that the sun was still high in the heavens, as though it were only tea time when the tables were being laid for dinner at the Grand Hotel. And so the great sliding windows remained open on to the Esplanade. I had only to step across a low wooden sill to find myself in the dining room, through which I walked to take the lift. As I passed the reception desk, I addressed a smile to the manager. Without the slightest twinge of distaste, collected one in return from a face which, since I had been at Balbec, my comprehensive study had impregnated and transformed like a natural history specimen. His features had become familiar to me, charged with a meaning that was of no importance, but nonetheless intelligible, like a script which one can read, and had ceased in any way to resemble those strange and repellent characteristics which his face had presented to me on that first day, when I had seen before me a personage now forgotten, or, if I succeeded in recalling him, unrecognizable, difficult to identify with this insignificant and polite individual, of which the other was but a caricature, a hideous and rapid sketch. Without either the shyness or the sadness of the evening of my arrival, I rang for the lift attendant, who no longer stood in silence while I rose by his side, as in a mobile thoracic cage, propelled upwards along the descending pillar, but repeated to me, there aren't the people now as there was a month back. They're beginning to go now. Days are drawing in. He said this not because there was any truth in it, but because, having an engagement presently on a warmer part of the coast, he would have liked us all to leave as soon as possible, so that the hotel could be shut up and he could have a few days to himself before rejoining his new place. Rejoin and new were not, as it happened, incompatible terms, since for the lift boy, rejoin was the usual form of the verb to join. The only thing that surprised me was that he condescended to say place, for he belonged to that modern proletariat which seeks to eliminate from its speech every trace of a career in service. And a moment later, indeed, he informed me that in the situation which he was about to rejoin, he would have a smarter tunic and a better salary, the words livery and wages sounding to him obsolete and unseemly. And since, by an absurd contradiction, the vocabulary has survived the conception of inequality among the masters, I was always failing to understand what the lift boy said. For instance, the only thing that interested me was to know whether my grandmother was in the hotel. Now, forestalling my question, the lift boy would say to me, that lady has just come out of your rooms. I was invariably taken in. I supposed he meant my grandmother. No, that lady who I think is an employee of yours. Since in the traditional vocabulary of the upper classes, which ought indeed to be done away with, a cook is not called an employee. I thought for a moment, but he must have made a mistake. We don't own a factory. We haven't any employees. Suddenly I remembered that the title of employee, like the wearing of a mustache among waiters, is a sop to their self-esteem given to servants, and realized that this lady who had just gone out must be Françoise, probably on a visit to the coffee maker or to watch the Belgian lady's maid at her sewing. Though even this sop did not satisfy the lift boy, for he would say, quite naturally, speaking pityingly of his own class, the working man, or the small man, using the same singular form as Racine when he speaks of the poor man. But as a rule, for my zeal and timidity of the first evening were now things of the past, I no longer spoke to the lift boy. It was he now who stood there and received no answer during the short journey on which he threaded his way to the hotel, which, hollowed out inside like a toy, deployed around us, floor by floor, the ramifications of its corridors and the depths of which the light grew velvety, lost its tone, blurred the communicating doors or the steps of the service station which it transformed into that amber haze, unsubstantial and mysterious as a twilight, in which Rembrandt picks out here and there a windowsill or a wellhead. And on each landing, a golden light reflected from the carpet indicated the setting sun and the lavatory window. I wondered whether the girls I had just seen lived at Baubec, and who they could be. When our desire is thus concentrated upon a little tribe of humanity which it singles out from the rest, everything that can be associated with that tribe becomes a spring of emotion and then of reflection. I had heard a lady say on the Esplanade, she's a friend of the Simonet girl, with that self-important air of inside knowledge, as who should say, he's the inseparable companion of young La Rochefoucauld. And immediately she had detected on the face of the person to whom she gave this information a curiosity to see more of the favored person who was a friend of the Simonet girl. A privilege, obviously, that did not appear to be granted to all the world. For aristocracy is a relative thing, and there are plenty of out-of-the-way places where the son of an upholsterer is the arbiter of fashion and reigns over a court like any young Prince of Wales. I've often since then sought to recall how it first sounded to me out there on the beach, that name of Simonet, still uncertain in its form, which I had not clearly distinguished, and also in its significance, its designation of such and such a person as opposed to another. Instinct, in short, with that vagueness and novelty which we find so moving in the sequel, when a name whose letters are every moment engraved more deeply in our hearts by our incessant thought of them, has become, though this was not to happen to me with the name of the Simonet girl until several years had passed, the first coherent sound that comes to our lips, whether on waking from sleep or on recovering from a fainting fit, even before the idea of what time it is or where we are, almost before the word I, as though the person on whom it names were more us than we are ourselves, and as though after a brief spell of unconsciousness the phase that is the first to dissolve were that in which we were not thinking of her. I do not know, I said to myself from the first, that the name Simonet must be that of one of the band of girls. From that moment I never ceased to wonder how I could get to know the Simonet family, get to know them, moreover, through people whom they would consider superior to themselves, which ought not to be difficult if they were only common little wenches, so that they might not form a disdainful idea of me. For one cannot have perfect knowledge, one cannot effect the complete absorption of a person who disdains one, so long as one has not overcome that disdain. And since, whenever the idea of women who are so different from us penetrates our minds, unless we are able to forget it or the competition of other ideas eliminates it, we know no rest until we have converted these aliens into something that is compatible with ourselves, the mind being in this respect endowed with the same kind of reaction and activity as our physical organism, which cannot abide the infusion of any foreign body into its veins without at once striving to digest and assimilate it. The Simone girl must be the prettiest of them all. She who, I felt moreover, might yet become my mistress, for she was the only one who, 2 or 3 times, half turning her head, had appeared to take cognizance of my fixed stare. I asked the lift boy whether he knew of any people at Balbec called Simone. Not liking to admit that there was anything he did not know, he replied that he seemed to have heard the name somewhere. When we reached the top floor, I asked him to send me up the latest list of visitors. I stepped out of the lift, but instead of going to my room, I made my way further along the corridor, for before my arrival, the valet in charge of the landing, despite his horror of drafts, had opened the window at the end, which, instead of looking out to the sea, faced the hill and valley inland, but never allowed them to be seen because its panes, which were made of clouded glass, were generally closed. I made a brief halt in front of it, time enough just to pay my devotions to the view which for once it revealed beyond the hill immediately behind the hotel, a view that contained only a single house situated at some distance, to which the perspective in the evening light, while preserving its mass, gave a gem-like precision in the velvet casing, as though to one of those architectural works in miniature, tiny temples or chapels wrought in gold and enamel, which serve as reliquaries and are exposed only on rare and solemn days for the veneration of the faithful. But this moment of adoration had already lasted too long, for the valet, who carried in one hand a bunch of keys and with the other saluted me by touching his sacristan's skullcap, though without raising it on account of the pure, cool evening, came and drew together, like those of a shrine, the 2 sides of the window, and so shut off the minute edifice, the glistening relic from my adoring gaze. I went into my room. Gradually, as the season advanced, the picture that I found there in my window changed. At first it was broad daylight, and dark only if the weather was bad. And then, in the greenish glass for which it descended, with the curve of its rounded waves, the sea, set between the iron uprights of my casement window like a piece of stained glass in its leads, raveled out over all the deep rocky border of the bay little plumed triangles of motionless foam, etched with the delicacy of a feather or a downy breast from Pisanello's pencil, and fixed in that white, unvarying, creamy enamel which is used to depict fallen snow in Gallet's glass. Presently the days grew shorter, and at the moment when I entered the room, the violet sky seemed branded with the stiff, geometrical, fleeting effulgent figure of the sun, like the representation of some miraculous sign of some mystical apparition, lowering over the sea on the edge of the horizon, like a sacred picture over a high altar, while the different parts of the western sky exposed in the glass fronts of the low mahogany bookcases that ran along the walls, which I carried back in my mind the marvelous painting from which they had been detached, seemed like those different scenes executed long ago for a confraternity by some old master on a reliquary, whose separate panels are now exhibited side by side in a gallery, so that the visitor's imagination alone can restore them to their place on the predella of the reredos. A few weeks later, when I went upstairs, the sun had already set, like the one that I used to see at Cambrai, behind the cavalry. When I came home from a walk and was getting ready to go down to the kitchen before dinner, a band of red sky above the sea, compact and clear cut as a layer of aspic over meat. Then, a little later, over sea already cold and steel blue, like a grey mullet, a sky of the same pink as the salmon that we should presently be ordering at Rivebelle, reawakened my pleasure in dressing to go out to dinner. Close to the shore, patches of vapor, soot black but with a burnish of consistency of agate, visibly solid and palpable, were trying to rise one above the another, over the sea in ever wider tiers, so that the highest of them, poised on top of the twisted column and overreaching the center of gravity of those which had hitherto supported them, seemed on the point of bringing down in ruin this lofty structure already halfway up the sky and precipitating it into the sea. The sight of a ship receding like a nocturnal traveler gave me the same impression that I had had in the train of being set free from the necessity of sleep and from confinement in a bedroom. Not that I felt myself prisoner in the room in which I was now, since in another hour I should be leaving it to drive away in a carriage. I threw myself down on the bed, and just as if I had been lying on a berth on board one of those steamers which I could see quite near me, and which at night it would be strange to see stealing slowly through the darkness, like shadowy and silent but unsleeping swans,
I was surrounded on all sides by pictures of the sea.
Thanks for not watching.